last time we left our intrepid explorer, poor Milo had, Milo was attempting to give Yule presents to everyone. Yay! I'm glad you're here and ready for the story. Milo was attempting to give Yule presents to everyone, and Hannah had apparently gone outside in the middle of a blizzard by herself, which just did not seem right for him. So he went out to try and find her, because obviously he had to. And he thinks he might have thrown a dagger in her and killed her, because something started attacking him in the whiteout. He couldn't see what it was, and he threw a dagger with True Strike on it, and then realized it's going in the direction of the Hannah's robes that he was using to track her. So yeah, Milo's having a really bad day right now. Not that Milo doesn't have his share of really bad days, but he's having a really, really bad one right now. And I kind of just want to get into it. Harry Potter and the Nat 20, Chapter 18, Red Christmas. Hannah? Milo asked, stunned. Gods, what have I done? There was no response. She can't be dead. It was only one attack, he thought to himself. It was a critical hit, said a tiny voice in his head. A critical hit on a dagger, the Milo insisted. She might only be level 1, wheedled the tiny voice. That's 6 damage tops, Milo protested. It's physically impossible for 6 damage to kill anything. Maybe back home, but have you seen any indication at all that these people only die at -10 hit points? Everything dies at -10, fact of the universe. Your universe. Remember how surprised Madame Pomfrey always is at your physiology? You can't take anything for granted. She can't be dead. Then why are you so afraid to go check on her? Milo couldn't think of a suitable response to that. Okay, Milo said, this time out loud. I'll go find her, and she'll be fine. Just fine. You'll see. Milo stood up from his prone position, shaking off snow. He waded through the deep snow to where locate object told him Hannah lay. Or is standing, Milo thought stubbornly. She could be standing there, happy as a clam. A happy clam, not like one of those sad clams. Hannah? Milo called again, yet was again unanswered. Abruptly, the snow stopped blocking Milo's vision. He realized vaguely that he was standing under the canopy of a tree, a nice, old-growth tree. Milo thought it might be a willow, but then wondered idly if this world even had willows. There was no reason to think they did, after all. Everything else seemed to be so completely different. Elves working in kitchens, no limit on spells per day, gradual learning instead of at discrete increments, goblins running banks, dragons slaughtered to make gloves, and, apparently, completely different damage and wound system. Hannah Abbott lay against the tree, slouched into a half-sitting position. Her wand was held loosely in her right hand. Her left was clutching the hilt of Milo's dagger, sticking out of her stomach. It was difficult to tell. Her school uniform was black, after all, but there was a lot of blood. A scary amount of blood. Her head was lulled to the side, and she wasn't moving. Oh gods, Milo said. Milo was far from a religious person, but if ever there was a time for divine intervention, that time was now. Hannah stirred feebly. Holy crap, Paylor, I owe you one. I'll slay some vampires for you when I get home. She reached for her wand. Milo blinked. Maybe she knows some healing spell? Hannah said weakly. Hey, Hannah, Milo said gently. You'll be okay, okay? I've got a healer's kit and a +1 from wisdom, so I can do first aid, okay? So just don't move. Milo slowly reached into his belt of hidden pouches for the kit. Ah, Hannah said again. Tell me back at the castle when you can explain just what you were doing out here, okay? Avracadabra! A brilliant green bolt shot out of the tip of Hannah's wand, but her shaking hand fouled her aim. A bush behind Milo burst into flame. Milo instinctively ducked behind a nearby tree as curses started flying again. Okay, Milo said. She's clearly possessed or something, and whatever's doing it is trying to kill me. As if to emphasize the point, a curse slammed into the other side of the tree Milo was using as cover, and dead leaves rained down, thinning out the canopy and allowing snow to start falling back onto Milo's head. Carefully, Milo, very slowly, peeked around the side of the tree. Hannah was still slumped on the ground, looking deathly pale. Milo pulled his head back just as a killing curse flew by, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from it, and the tip of his nose burned as if it had been exposed to the sun for hours. How am I supposed to help a person who's bleeding to death if they're trying to kill me? Milo wondered. If I go over to her and try to stabilize her, or for that matter depossess her with protection from evil, which requires physical contact, I'll end up as dead as this tree. Milo heard Hannah coughing weakly. It was a wet, gurgling sound. Oh, that cannot be good. I can blind her with glitter dust, but really I have no idea what that would do to her in this state. If a single dagger can do this, I shouldn't really take any chances. For all I know, glitter dust could kill her outright. On the other hand, doing nothing will kill her. I'm really sorry about this, Milo said around the corner. Glitter dust! Hundreds of thousands of golden sparks flew out of Milo's spread hand, illuminating the thick white snow like twinkling fairy lights. Her silence was uncanny. Normally, when people are blinded by glitter dust, they scream and complain and flail around, but Hannah, if she had any response, Milo couldn't tell. Maybe she made her will save, Milo thought, and she could see just fine, and if I stick my head out again, the last thing I see will be green. Well, at least it's holiday appropriate. Had Hannah been carrying a gun, or had Milo been from this universe to begin with, he likely would have slowly stuck a hand out to determine if his attacker would reopen fire. At worst, by that logic, your hand will be injured. However, in Milo's form of magic, the location on the body that the spell hit is irrelevant. If disintegrate hits even your baby toe, you're powder. As far as Milo knew, and he didn't even question that this wasn't the case, if Avada Kedavra so much as glances the tip of your finger, you're waking up in your alignment-appropriate outer planar afterlife. Milo stepped out from around his safety, praying to his often forgotten deities that whatever was possessing Hannah had been blinded. The thing about snow, especially thick snow, is that it's impossible to walk through it without making a distinctive crunching sound. As soon as Milo had taken a single step, her unseeing, bloodshot eyes whipped towards his general direction, wand raised. A red curse of some sort flew out of Hannah's wand, but missed him by several yards, and impacted the snow harmlessly, causing a cloud of steam to erupt as the snow flash melted. Milo felt like an idiot. They need wands to cast, he thought. That little stick really should have been my first target. Grease, Milo cast, not on the ground underneath Hannah, or even on Hannah herself, but on her wand. Hannah remained expressionless, but Milo imagined, perhaps somewhat fancifully, that her possessor at least blinked in surprise as her only weapon slipped harmlessly out of her hands, landing lightly on the soft snow. In some detached part of his brain, Milo realized that this was the first battle he'd ever won in which he really didn't care. about the XP he earned. Milo heaved a sigh of relief and walked over to his injured friend. Master's Touch, Milo cast, granting him a +4 to heal, which combined with his naturally high wisdom and his healer's kit would allow him to make the check to stabilize Hannah. Sudden insight flooded his brain about human anatomy and emergency medical procedures. Okay, I'd best leave the dagger in, he said quietly, because I could do more damage just taking it out. Hannah stared at him blankly, her eyes still wide open. Milo winced. Human reflex. When looking at an unexceptionally bright light, such as a laser or in this case glitter dust, is to close one's eyes immediately to prevent damage. Whatever was controlling Hannah had evidently overridden that instinct, leaving her eyes red and bloodshot, glittering gold like the rest of her. Unfortunately, there was nothing Milo could do to end the spell once it had started. As Milo got to work cleaning the injury and trying to stop the bleeding, Hannah stirred again. What, you're not still trying to kill me, are you? Milo asked, surprised. As a precaution, he dismissed the grease spell on the wand and stashed it in his belt of hidden pouches. Despite her injuries, Hannah moved like lightning, ignoring pain entirely. One moment her hands were at her sides, the next they were pulling the dagger out of her own injury. Milo blinked, then snorted. What is she going to do, he thought. Stab me? Unlike her, I have 12 hit points. That's 3 good stabs before I even notice it, minimum. Hannah lunged at Milo, nicking his arm for a paltry 2 damage. Better safe than sorry, Milo said mostly to himself. Protection from evil. He tapped Hannah on the forehead, and a glowing gold cylinder briefly appeared around Hannah before, leaving her protected from the mental control for the duration of the spell, which was 7 minutes with the help of his arcanist's gloves. Gah! Hannah shrieked in pain, rubbing at her eyes frantically. This only had the effect of smearing blood into them. Hey, Hannah, it's okay, Milo said in what he hoped would be a soothing tone. Your vision will return in a few seconds. I know it's hard, but I need you to stop moving while I try to deal with the bleeding, okay? Can you do that for me? Mutely, Hannah nodded, tears flowing from her eyes. Morty climbed out of Milo's belt and helped him hold a bandage in place while Milo tied it off. The rat knew, without any form of communication necessary, exactly where to be and what to do to help Milo the most. A combination of their long partnership, empathetic link, and the fact that Morty benefited from Milo's Master's Touch spell just as much as he did. Hannah started to say. A brief memory of when he first encountered her out here, and she struggled to say the words to curse him came to mind. Don't say anything, Milo said. I'm sorry, Hannah said weakly. It's fine. I'm here. I have magic. I can get you to safety, Milo said. How the hell am I going to pull that off? He wondered. All I have left are benign transportation, featherfall, a pair of prestidigitations, dancing light, and a mage hand. Not for the first or last time. Milo wished he was a cleric. Why, oh why didn't I buy that healing belt back in Myra, city of light, city of magic, when I had the chance, he thought bitterly, or at least a few potions of cure light wounds. Milo said, I don't mean to shake your confidence in my abilities or anything, he said cautiously, but I don't suppose you know any healing spells? Sorry, she said. I'm useless. Untrue, Milo lied. Dancing lights, he cast, in a vain hope that someone would see it and come to their rescue. In the current weather, however, that seemed all but impossible. I flew here in a more or less straight line at 120 feet per round for 5 minutes, sans 1 minute to cast Circle Dance. That's 4,800 feet, or almost a mile. Normally I can hustle on foot at 60 feet per per round, but carrying Hannah will cut that down to 40, and the snow will take that down to 20. Milo managed to conceal a groan. It would take, assuming everything went well, which, in his experience, was rare to the point of impossibility, 24 minutes to hike Hannah back to the castle. 24 freezing minutes through snow deeper than he was tall. 24 minutes at maximum carrying capacity. Milo glanced at Hannah, who was shivering in a somewhat concerning manner. He really wasn't sure if she'd make it that far. Milo figured his best bet was to rig up some form of shelter, then return to the castle to get help. Fortunately, for being an experienced adventurer, he was absolutely loaded with gear to help with the first part of that plan. "So," Milo said in a conversational tone, "I'm going to make a tent. Keep the snow off of you, all right?" A thought struck him. "But first, here." He reached a hand into one of the pockets out of his belt and fished out a heavy, thick fur winter blanket and placed it over her shivering body. Milo, like any decent wizard, tried to be prepared for anything. "Thanks," she muttered. As an afterthought, he passed her his bedroll as well. Pulling fine silk rope, made by elves, of course, and thick canvas sheets out of his magic belt, he immediately got down to work. He tied the rope between the 4 nearby trees in an X shape and used the canvas sheets, of which he had 5, to create walls and a ceiling. Looking critically at the result, which was most certainly not up to any code you could ever name, Milo realized that the whole thing would fall apart if a decent-sized twig fell on it from one of the overhanging trees. To remedy this, he strung up a large fishing net about 4 feet over the tent to catch falling objects. Lastly, Milo cut a small hole in the center of the roof to allow smoke out, and started hunting for decent-sized sticks to use as firewood. He had his obligatory wizard staff, of course, and his 11-foot pole, but the idea of burning either of those things was too horrible to contemplate. After finding a few moderately dry twigs, Milo gave up and decided to use a bucket as kindling. Yes, he carried a wooden bucket in his extra-dimensional belt. You never know when a bucket might come in handy. Just because it never has, doesn't mean it never will. The whole process took about 10 minutes. Milo was just stepping back to briefly admire his crude handiwork when he realized he should have been keeping better track of time. Protection from evil only lasted 7 minutes. Hannah could have been repossessed for quite some time while he was wasting time breaking a bucket into pieces. Milo asked nervously, sticking his head into the covered area. "I don't mean to be, insensitive or anything." Hannah asked. "You don't feel, evil or anything?" "Nope," she said. Good, Milo said dubiously. "Well, what would she do if she were anyways? Spit at me?" "Well, if you start feeling an overwhelming urge to murder me, will you let me know, would you?" Hannah simply nodded weakly. Milo briefly considered manacling her, but quickly decided against it. If anything, that would give her possessing spirit, ghost, demon, whatever, assuming it was still in her, a heavy metal improvised bludgeon. Milo glanced at the pile of firewood he'd created out of his bucket, one of his ever-dwindling physical ties to his old world, and sighed. He could light it with prestidigitation, of course, but he was already running precariously low on magic, and didn't think wasting it on something so frivolous would be a good idea. Grumbling to himself, Milo employed the decidedly mundane method of flint and steel. "You carry all this stuff around with you?" Hannah asked. It was the longest sentence he'd heard her say since her accident. "Yeah," Milo said, clicking away ineffectually at the flint. A few pathetic sparks appeared, but nothing ignited. "Saved me from the troll. Well, sort of. I mean, I got thrown through the window anyways, but it helped. A bit. Maybe." "If you give me my wand," Hannah said, "I can light that for you." Milo, grateful had his hand halfway to the appropriate belt pocket when his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "No thanks," he said. "I love doing this by hand. Very zen." He also had tinder twigs, of course, but he preferred to save those for a situation in which he really needed fire as a standard action. It took a while, but eventually Milo got his pitiful small fire going. "Okay," Milo said. "Now look, I'm going to go and get help," he said gently. "You stay here, all right?" "You're leaving me alone?" Hannah asked him. No. You will have Morty to protect you." With a flash of cold, unhappy sleep, Milo pulled his protesting familiar from his warm home in his belt. "Now, I know he doesn't look like much, but trust me, he is a badass." Hannah gave him a peculiar look when, over the crackling of the flames, they heard a loud crunch from the snow outside. "Stay here," Milo commanded unnecessarily. He hesitated for a moment, then dived out of the tent as fast as he could, hoping to take whatever was out there by surprise. Standing outside, looking somewhat surprised, was the most horrible little creature that Milo had seen in a long, long time. It looked a little like a goblin, with thick, leathery green skin, red eyes, and long, sharp nails. It was wearing crudely tanned leather breeches, but was naked from the waist up. Milo shuddered to think how cold that would be. As the creature recovered from its surprise, it grinned at him. Its teeth, of which it had several rows, had at some point been filed to needle-sharp points. In one hand was a short, crude, wickedly curved, needlessly hooked, serrated sword. Its most distinctive feature, by far, was its bright, unevenly dyed, blood-red hat. "Holy crap, Redcap!" Milo gasped in surprise. He'd hoped that the psychotic, mass-murdering, evil little Fae didn't have an alternate universe version in this world. Milo wasn't sure whether the thing had been attracted by the smoke from the fire, commanded here by whatever had possessed Hannah, or was simply attracted by the girl's blood. Unfortunately for Milo, who had already burned his one nerve skitter for the day, the Redcap had a +5 initiative bonus. The weird little creature, which are easily repelled by a variety of simple charms and hexes, none of which Milo knew or was, in any case, able to cast, charged at him and let out a screeching, high-pitched, undulating wail. The Redcap brought its blade down in a high overhead chop, which Milo caught, frantically, on the arm of his enchanted robe as he raised his hands in panic. "Acid splash!" Milo cast desperately. A thick green glob of acid hit the Redcap full in the face, causing it to take a step backwards, clutching at its head. Milo knew that proper Redcaps had upwards of 22 hit points, depending on how many sentient creatures they've slain, although he had no idea what it would take to phase this world's equivalent. This Redcap, its face now red and raw, again charged Milo, who put his 14 dexterity to good use and sidestepped, just barely avoiding the wickedly sharp steel weapon. Milo, now out of spells, pulled his least favorite backup plan out of his belt. Every wizard has a staff. They come standard issue. Some are gnarled and rough, some are covered in glowing arcane runes, while some are plain and practical. Many staves are magical, although a smart wizard realizes that, by and large, magical staves are overpriced and distinctly use-impaired. Nevertheless, as has already been stated, every wizard has a staff. A staff, for a wizard, is like his robe or pointy hat. A wizard without one of these things would be lacking his political career without a scandal, or a trip to the dentist without an unpleasant aftertaste. Everyone knows this. Hells, even muggles know this. A staff is a symbol of a wizard's power, of the triumph of knowledge and reason over the chaos and insanity. Note that sorcerers, by the way, generally prefer spears, although this is certainly a coincidence. And as a warning to others, do not meddle, for I am subtle and quick to anger. Also for me, reality is a plaything. What most people tend to forget is that, in addition to all of these things, a staff is also a large, heavy, wooden stick. A stick which Milo brought down on the head of the enraged Redcap. Hard. While the redcap staggered in pain, Mordecai crept up behind it. The redcap took another swing, enraged beyond reason, but its quarry vanished just before the blade struck home. There was a quiet popping sound, and a small spotted rat sat in the ground in front of it, staring upwards with unblinking eyes. Transposition, Milo finished casting, standing now where Morty had been lurking just a moment earlier. With a meaty thud, Milo whacked the redcap again, this time on the back of its hard skull. Redcaps back at Milo's home. Milo was still thought of them as real redcaps, although the one standing in front of him looked and smelled pretty damn real, could only be hurt by cold iron. However, from what Milo could tell, this world didn't even have cold iron, so these redcaps, in the interest of fairness and balance, must, by Milo's somewhat screwy meta logic, therefore be without damage reduction. It was a risk Milo figured he had no choice but to take, as the staff did slightly more damage than the dagger, and Milo badly needed all the killing power he could get. "This is so unfair," Milo said, narrowly catching a poorly aimed blow with his staff. "Clerics get the same number of spells as I do, but they also have a good base attack bonus and armor proficiencies." The redcap gave no sign of understanding him, and continued to flail wildly at him. Milo blocked a surprisingly amateurish high attack with his staff. And even if that's not enough, they can just command armies of undead to go in first. The redcap, taking advantage of Milo's now raised staff, slashed at him expertly in the stomach through the somewhat unreliable robe of arcane might, leaving Milo with 6 HP. "And druids," Milo said, jabbing the redcap in the solar plexus with the butt of his staff. "Don't even get me started on druids. Armor, hit points, good base attack bonus, full casting?" The redcap made another feint, which Milo, now that he'd cottoned on to the Fae's trickery, failed to fall for. And failing that, they have a wolf backing them up. Milo swung, but the redcap rolled to its right with surprising agility for something so wrinkly and ugly. And failing that, Milo continued his rant uninterrupted, swinging his staff horizontally like a baseball bat, and taking the redcap dead on the side of the head with a satisfying thwack. "They can just turn into a goddamn grizzly bear." The redcap, realizing that Milo had overextended himself, slapped him hard on the wrist with the edge of his blade. Milo dropped the staff as his hand, ignoring frantic orders from his brain, released the polished darkwood weapon, which the Fae contemptuously kicked off into the snow. Milo staggered backwards, drawing his dagger with his left hand. By our standards, Milo was more or less ambidextrous, although to him the word ambidextery meant something completely different. And he eyed up the redcap. By his calculations, assuming this beastie was anything like those that he was familiar with, the redcap have somewhere in the vicinity of 3 hit points remaining. Milo's dagger, propelled by his scrawny frame, was capable of doing exactly that much damage, assuming he hit. Well, it was risky, but it just might work. Milo took a deep breath, and on the exhale, released the dagger in a powerful overhand throw. It spun once, twice, 3 times, and buried itself to the hilt in a tree about 10 feet from the redcap. Unfortunately for Milo, while his physics did run on a number of different story conventions, poor rolls can and do happen regardless of dramatic necessity. The redcap messily ran Milo through the stomach with his serrated sword. "Gah!" Milo gasped, suddenly tasting blood. He fell into the deep snow and tried to scurry away backwards from his attacker. He got a respectable distance away, leaving a trail of blood, before bumping into most inconveniently placed tree. Milo glanced back at the redcap, who was, to Milo's disgust, licking Milo's own blood off the edge of his weapon with a long, almost prehensile tongue, making horrible little sounds of delight, as if tasting, for the first time, Fine Belgian chocolate. Milo coughed weakly, spitting blood. He only had 1 hit point remaining, meaning his wounds weren't exactly physically debilitating. They just hurt like hell. The redcap, finally finished with its little snack, looked at Milo with a hungry expression. Throwing his sword to the side carelessly, it ran up to Milo on its stubby little legs. Morty, hanging onto the creature's legs, bit the redcap repeatedly on the ankles. Despite himself, Milo grinned. A rat's bite deals a pathetic 1d3 minus 4 damage, which, as a simple math will tell you, is a maximum of -1. However, the minimum damage any attack can deal is 1, meaning Morty was slowly, steadily, from regular attacks and attacks of opportunity, gnawing that redcap's heel to death. The redcap's collision with Milo was almost meteoric, and Milo found himself pinned against the tree, the redcap holding both of his arms down with deceptive wiry strength. To Milo's revulsion, the redcap bent down to Milo's stomach and started licking at his open wound with its long, slimy tongue. Milo, who had never really understood the grapple rules, struggled in vain against the Fae's superior strength. Any adventurer, other than a monk, is essentially worthless at unarmed combat. Unarmed strikes get a massive penalty to hit, deal non-lethal damage, and barely any at that, and provoke an attack of opportunity. Fortunately, from what Milo could tell, nobody had taught the locals about AOOs, which was reasonable enough, as they were bloody confusing. Further, unarmed strikes have one thing going for them. They can be made with virtually any part of the body. Milo's arms and legs were pinned underneath the grotesque little abomination, but his head wasn't. Thwack! Milo headbutted the freak with colossal effort, his skull colliding with the redcap's hard, leathery head and leaving him seeing stars. The damage was, frankly, negligible. However, it was, thanks to Morty's repeated bites, combined with the beating Milo had given it earlier, enough. The redcap toppled over onto the ground, unconscious. Milo slumped against the tree warily, his forehead damp with blood from the redcap's blood-stained cap, and started laughing weakly. He couldn't help himself. "Now what do wizards get?" he asked to nobody in particular. "A heavy wooden stick, a rat, and a phenomenal cosmic power beyond that which mortal man was meant to tamper. And sometimes that's enough." Milo stood up, brushed himself off, and with a cast of mage hand and a casual gesture, pulled his dagger out of the tree. It had floated into his hand as he stumbled over the redcap and administered a coup de grace. Adventurers are not known for their mercy, especially to things that look like goblins, and staggered into the makeshift tent. Hannah gasped when she saw him. "What happened out there?" she asked. "I was so worried I thought maybe I could help, but I didn't have my wand, so I couldn't see what I could possibly do. There were shouts and a weird scream and sounds of fighting." "Redcap," Milo muttered, falling down onto the ground wearily. "Oh, that's all?" Hannah asked, looking visibly relieved. "Did you drive it off with—" "Nope," said Milo. "Well, how about—" "No dice," Milo said with a groan. "Different magic, remember?" "Well, okay. What do you usually do to get rid of redcaps?" Carpet bombing with fireballs from 800 feet away, then toss their teeth. That's all they leave behind from where I'm from, into the elemental plane of fire to prevent anyone from raising them. This one, I just used my head." Hannah gasped. "You're injured. Pass me my wand. I'll cast Ipixki." Milo froze. His suspicions were confirmed. "So you're still in there," Milo said grimly. Hannah stared at him, confused. Hannah doesn't know any healing charms. Hannah, or whatever was controlling her, froze for a moment. "Ah," she said finally, and glanced frantically around the shelter like a cornered bobcat. So here's what's going to happen now, Milo said firmly. I don't care who you are, but I will find out. And when I do, whether you're Snape, Lucius, the ghost of Salazar Slytherin, or bloody Voldemort himself. Hannah winced at Milo's use of the name, confirming that it wasn't the Dark Lord. I will find you, and I will kill you. Hannah's eyes widened. This is non-negotiable. Hannah stared at Milo briefly, then spoke. You foolish, ignorant boy, she said in a cold, low voice. Just because you can defeat a handful of Death Eaters and a Redcap doesn't mean you're capable of... You have no idea what I'm capable of, Milo spat. There are depths to which I will stoop, if necessary, depths which you've never even dreamed of. Tell me, Milo said, his voice low, have you ever heard of a candle of invocation? Despite herself, Hannah shook her head. Milo grinned. Pray that you never do, for there lies the path of darkness and extreme munchkinery. A candle of invocation is a minor magic item that helps clerics concentrate when preparing spells. Its other use allows it to summon extra player beings via the gate spell, including Efreeti, which, while under the summoner's control, can be ordered to grant 3 wishes, say for a permanent +1 intelligence boost, 25,000 gold points, and another candle of invocation. The candles were prohibited items of dark magic in the Azael Empire, and trafficking them was seen as worse than trafficking in human souls. The Empire had an entire task force of high-level wizards whose sole job was to prevent their use. Not that it was necessary, as the gods themselves will step in and simply delete the soul of anyone who attempted to create them before completion. It was one of the few things that all gods agreed upon. But there was no Azael Empire in this world, and judging by the lack of divine magic, no deities, at least no active ones. With one candle, I can challenge the gods. So here's the deal, Milo said, feeling somewhat numb from loss of blood. If you leave my friend now, and I mean within 12 seconds of when I finish speaking, I won't kill you until I'm strong enough to do it fairly. If I ever so much as get a hint that you even touch her again, I'll sell my alignment to the demon prince of the lower aerial kingdoms. Milo was very careful not to say his name, for bad things, in capital letters, could happen. For a candle before you can say mortal outrage, and then I will find you. There's magic that will let me do it instantly, and then I will kill you, slowly. And then I will rip out your soul and trap it in a shiny rock, which I will then hide on a moon. Which moon, orbiting which planet, orbiting which star, in which galaxy, I will leave to your imagination, so you can never be brought back. Greater Teleport had no range limitations at all. Hannah opened her mouth briefly, but Milo cut her off. And before you ask, the Demon Prince only answers the summon of good characters, so that rules you out. And me, Milo conveniently forgot to add, because I'm true neutral. Milo stared at Hannah directly in the eyes, and she stared back. I finished talking. You have 12 seconds. 1, Milo counted, and Hannah stared coldly at him. 2, said Milo, but Hannah's expression remained unchanged. 3, Hannah's gaze intensified, her normally sweet, happy expression twisted into one of contempt. 4, Milo briefly wondered if he was going to have to go through with it in the end, and whether Parazu was interested in branching out and tempting the souls of neutrals. 5, the flame in the middle of the tent crackled and snapped, tiny glowing embers flying out like a mundane glitter dust. 6, Milo readied an action to say Paruzu 3 times if he didn't get any sign that Hannah was released from her enslavement within the next round. He was committed now. 7. Hannah's expression wavered slightly for a brief, almost imperceptible moment. 8. Hannah blinked. Milo suppressed a smile. Sure, he'd won. 9. Hannah broke into a wicked cackle, made all the more disconcerting because it was still made with her voice. 10. Milo continued, trying to pretend he was unfazed. 11. Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. I'm going to summon a demon prince into this universe. The worst rated action ever. What was I thinking? Abruptly, Hannah collapsed from her rigid posture and fell to the ground. Milo heaved a sigh of relief. Hannah? He asked. Yeah, she said weakly. It's me again. Any chance you can, I don't know, prove it? Maybe? Milo asked hopefully. I don't think so, but you have to believe me. I'm so sorry. So much for that idea. What the hells is happening? He asked. I don't know. It's like I could hear this voice giving me these suggestions, and they seemed like such a good idea at the time, and it made me so happy to follow them. She shuddered. I'm so sorry. I tried to kill you. She started crying. What? No, you didn't. That's absurd. You were possessed, obviously. Otherwise, protection from evil wouldn't have helped. What? She asked. Trust me on this one. I'd bet you didn't even know how to cast those curses you were sending at me, right? No. There you have it. We're safe. Kalu away. Kalu Kalay. Milo collapsed back onto the ground. He hadn't even noticed when it had happened, but at some point during the staring contest, he'd gone into a crouching position. Standing would be all but impossible in the confines of Milo's crude shelter. Are you all right? Hannah asked. You look kind of drenched in blood. You should see the other guy, Milo muttered, his eyes closed. But seriously, she said, her voice starting to come back to her. You need help at least as much as I do. What are we going to do? She asked, panic evidently rising. Milo laughed. Me? I'll be fine. I can just sleep off anything short of death, trust me. Which is more than I can say for that red cap outside. Wait, what was it you said earlier? I wasn't really all there. There was something about a red cap? Yeah, I think it smelled your blood. Sorry about that. By the way, I didn't know it was you. The red cap, Hannah pressed. Did you kill it? Yeah, I made pretty sure of that. And it's right outside? Yeah, but trust me, it's not going anywhere. Bury it! Oh, come on, it's just some random monster. Don't you ever listen in defense? They're attracted by spilled blood. Yeah, I know that, but I don't see... Oh. Get out there and bury it before it attracts more. You don't have to tell me twice, or, 3 times, Milo said, getting to his feet with a wince, and crawled out of the improvised tent. He stumbled over to the dead red cap, grabbing his falling quarterstaff on the way. He groaned, using it as an improvised shovel. This is the worst, he muttered to the red cap. The absolute worst. I mean, you're dead, but you've got it lucky, he said between jabs of his staff to loosen up the snow. It's like practically forest fell conditions out here, and I decided to make a bloody robes resistant to bloody heat. And I've got to dig a great bloody big hole in the ground for you. And believe me, the less time I spend around you, the better. After every good dig with his staff, he reached down and pulled out handfuls of snow. And you know what the worst part is? He asked the corpse. No, I guess you don't, because you're dead. The absolute worst part is, right now, you know what would actually help? The damned bucket. Milo scooped another handful of the freezing snow out of the quickly growing pit. Been carrying it around in my pocket for 3 years, and when, for once, I actually need it, It's in bloody chateau canvas, keeping someone else warm while I'm out here digging a big hole in the ground. And did I mention how cold it is? Fortunately, the ex-redcap wasn't very large, and snow was much easier to dig in than dirt. It took him about an hour to finish, but when it had, Milo unceremoniously pushed the little monstrosity into the pit face first. As an afterthought, he threw the thing's weird little sword in after it, then piled in several feet of snow. And good riddance too, he muttered. Ain't nobody gets to lick me and walk away from it. With that, he trudged back into what he could charitably be called a tent. Milo stumbled back inside again, and face down, immediately drifted off into sleep. He wasn't quite sure how long he was out for, but when he woke up, the fire had burned low and the sun had gone down. At some point, someone had either animated his winter blanket, or Hannah had put it on him. "Happy Christmas, Hannah," he said wearily. "Happy Christmas, Milo," Hannah replied, sounding just as tired. Her stomach rumbled. "Hey, I don't suppose you still have any of those everlasting rations?" "Nah, they ran out weeks ago," Milo responded automatically. "What, really?" Milo sighed and passed the blue bag over to her, trying very hard not to roll his eyes. Hannah took a bite. "It's completely tasteless," she said. "That's so weird." "It's all I've got," he confessed, "unless you want 5 pounds of garlic powder." Milo frowned. Something Ron had said was coming back to him. "What's Christmas dinner?" he asked curiously, stoking the fire in an unsuccessful attempt to get it back up a bit. Hannah explained in great detail, lovingly describing the wonders of roast beef, mashed potatoes thickly covered in gravy with carrots and peas on the side, and a salad for Dad, 'cause of his cholesterol. Her eyes glazed over somewhat, and Milo was briefly worried that she'd gone again, under the effects of the possessor. "Pass that back for a second," Milo said, gesturing at the everlasting rations. Hannah, looking surprised, complied. Milo, in the past, gone at great lengths about the uses and abuses of prestidigitation, which, despite the fact that it's used by novice arcanists for practice, he firmly believed ought to be remained least wish. Among its many uses, which have saved our hero's hide any number of times, are the ability to soil or clean a large area, which comes in very handy during many detentions spent cleaning the thousands of Hogwarts statues and armor, move about a pound of material, recolor objects, or of course, potions, create flimsy little objects, or change something's taste for up to 1 hour. Prestidigitation, Milo cast. It was his last, best spell. He passed the rations back to Hannah, who looked confused. "Try it now," he urged. Hannah took a bite of the granola-like rations, and her eyes widened. "It tastes like..." She paused mid-sentence to take another bite. "Like..." Hannah said again, but seemed at a loss for words. "Christmas dinner?" Milo suggested. "Exactly," Hannah voiced her agreement. "Beautiful. Now pass me some here. I'm starving." That was Chapter 18, Red Christmas. We are now moving to Chapter 19, after I take a necessary water break. Chapter 19, Visitors. Deciding that saying something tastes like Christmas dinner would be categorically impossible for a dark wizard utilizing their titular dark powers to mentally control an injured 11-year-old girl, Milo had relented and returned Hannah's wand in order for her to magic up some fire to warm their freezing tent. It was late. Milo wasn't sure how late, because his nap of unknown length had thrown his perception of passing rounds, and the sun went down very early this far north in the dead of winter, when they heard yet another audible crunch in the snow outside, waking Milo up from the deep sleep he hadn't quite realized he'd ever started. Milo cursed, figuratively speaking, not a literal curse. Milo briefly wondered if that had been the reason the locals seemed to use the word cuss under his breath. And not only because there was a decent probability that the redcaps, as the local called them, buddies had come to finish off what the first one had started, or perhaps to finish off the first one, yum. He required 8 hours of continuous, uninterrupted rest to prepare new spells and regain hit points, so his injuries, which would have certainly killed someone from Hannah's world, were exactly as painful and sore as they were however long ago it was since they'd been inflicted. Milo glanced over at Hannah, whose eyes were wide and alert. Well, we're screwed, he thought. Milo, as stealthily as he could, which is not admittedly particularly stealthy without any ranks and hide or move silently, pulled his quarterstaff out of his belt of hidden pouches and raised the tent flap very slightly. Unfortunately, he couldn't see anything but snow from his narrow window. Stay here, Milo said quietly to Hannah. I'll go see what's outside. Hannah, her face pale and ashen, became determined. No, she's whispered. I've got a wand and I can do magic, which is more than I can say for you. But, Milo said, 100 protests coming to mind. You're not a PC, your injuries are debilitating, my arm are not, you're a lower level, the spells you know are not combat optimized. But despite everything, the practical part of his mind agreed that she did have a point. Hannah, despite being a novice at magic, had no limit on spells per day, and even simple jinxes and hexes that Hogwarts students used on each other to settle heated disagreements would be more effective than a quarterstaff wielded at a measly +2 base attack bonus and a -1 strength penalty, at least when he used that number that Hannah was capable of, which was infinite. Fine, we'll go together, he said at last. On 3, we leap out of the tent and catch them by surprise. Try to stand behind me. My robes are enchanted to protect me. I'll club anything that gets close. You hex anything that moves. Milo couldn't believe he was volunteering to tank damage so someone else could cast. It was just so wrong. Okay, Hannah said, fear and excitement battling evident in almost equal parts in her voice. And remember, you're braver than you think. I'm braver than I think. I'm braver than I think, Hannah said, constantly repeating the words under her breath as she did in the sorting ceremony. 1, 2, Milo took a deep breath. 3! The two heavily injured spellcasters did not so much charge out of the tent, which would have been perhaps more dramatically appropriate, as they did stagger out painfully. They were a pretty pathetic sight, and the only foes they would have intimidated would be those who were both squeamish about blood and who were in possession of excellent night vision. To the heroes in question, however, it felt as if they were leading a charge into the Battle of Vienna, with the might of tens of thousands of heavily armed and armored elite cavaliers at their back, all thirsting for blood. Wah! Wah in the ruddy hell! Came a surprised, thickly accented voice from the chill darkness. Mr. Hagrid? Hannah asked, stunned. Dancing lights, Milo cast, while Hannah cast Lumos. 4 glowing white spheres of light shot out of Milo's hands, flying in a search pattern around their immediate vicinity, while Hannah's wand tip glowed brightly. Hagrid's huge body came into clear view, holding his crossbow in one hand and Fang's leash in the other. What are you lot doing out here? Hagrid asked. And is that blood? Milo narrowed his eyes. How do I know you're really Hagrid? He asked suspiciously, leaning heavily on his quarterstaff. What kind of question is that? Hagrid asked. You know another bloke of my size who just happens to have a crossbow and a dog? I think, Hannah said quietly to Milo, that we'd best trust him. He's kind of our only hope. Milo still stared at him suspiciously, trying to decide what he would do if he had the ability to simply possess people, something that he didn't, as he'd forsworn the enchantment school altogether when he specialized in conjuration. Presumably, powerful wizards and witches had some form of defense against mental intrusion. Otherwise, Dumbledore would long since have been turned into a puppet of some dark wizard and used to rule the world. Likely that ruled McGonagall, Snape, Flitwick, Quirrell out as well as potential puppets, although not as suspects necessarily. Milo needed another glance at his plot flowchart to remind him who was currently trying to kill him. Hagrid, who apparently had no magical power of his own at all, was therefore an obvious choice to possess, at least at first glance. If Milo were behind this, he'd simply choose another student. Obviously, the possessor was able to force his puppets to use spells the puppets would normally be unable to, which necessarily bumped up any possessed student to Dark Master level of threat. So, assuming his possessor had, in fact, any brains at all, and Milo's numerous assumptions were somewhat correct, Hagrid was probably just Hagrid. Okay, Milo said, but be careful. Now, can someone explain what the ruddy hell is going on? Actually, never mind that, Hagrid said, looking closer at the extent of Hannah and Milo's injuries. We gotta get ye up to the hospital wing. Can you walk? Never mind, I'll just carry you. You can explain on the way. Hagrid hung his crossbow from a strap on his shoulder and held out a big, meaty hand to Hannah and Milo. Neither he nor Hannah had the same level of friendship with Hagrid that Harry, and to a lesser extent Ron and Hermione, had developed, and the pair of them hesitated for a moment. Milo shrugged and climbed aboard, Hannah soon following suit. Hagrid carried the pair of them in a surprisingly gentle manner, given his somewhat brutish appearance. On the way, Milo decided he might as well tell Hagrid what happened. Hannah, however, was being unusually silent. This morning, I heard that Hannah went out into the snow. Are ye mad, girl? Hagrid asked Hannah. Sorry, Hannah said in a quiet voice. Hang on, Hagrid, it wasn't her idea. I went out after her. Why didn't ye just tell Dumbledore or McGonagall? Hagrid asked. Milo said. Why hadn't he told anyone? In hindsight, what he'd done seemed remarkably stupid. Anyways, I tracked her down with magic, eventually, but she tried to hex me. Why would you do that? Hagrid asked. Pretty bad manners, if you ask me. Wasn't her choice, Hagrid, Milo said again, patiently. She was being controlled by magic or something. What? Hagrid asked, and stopped moving. Are you sure? Oh, pretty sure, all right, Milo said, Hannah's horrible, uncaring expression coming back to mind. We have to tell Dumbledore, Hagrid said, and started moving again, and this time at a greatly increased pace. Milo carried on, explaining about the encounter with the Redcap. Why didn't you just use... Hagrid began. Milo interrupted, not wanting to go into the details about how he was a different sort of wizard. Never quite got a hang of that spell. Well, what about... Nope, not that one. You really gotta do more practicing, Hagrid urged. Them ruddy simple spells. Yeah, I'll do that. And the Redcap's what, hurtin' Hannah? Hagrid asked, wading through the snow as if it wasn't there. Milo fell silent for a moment, at a loss for words. The terrible fear he'd felt when he'd first realized who his attacker was returned like a defeated dark wizard with access to the clone spell. Yeah, Hannah said. Used Milo's knife on me. Fortunately, Milo knows a bit of muggle medicine, or... She trailed off and fell back into silence. First sensible thing you did all day, Hagrid said critically. And I be having a word with Flitwick. Healing charms ought to be in the curriculum. Ruddy useful they are. Not that I know firsthand, of course. No, Milo said, wanting to press through this next awkward bit as quickly as possible. I, killed the Redcap. Thought you said you didn't have your wand. I used a big stick. The other Redcaps aren't going to like that, Hagrid said, concerned. But it explains Fang. Oh? Milo asked, curious. About a half an hour ago, he made a high racket, so I let him out. Must have smelled its blood. Redcaps have a very distinct scent, you know. Led me right to you. Might have saved your lives. That's very convenient, Milo said, looking at the dog. Suspicion started to grow in his mind, but he shook them off. Surely he was just being paranoid, seeing puppeteering behind every shadow. Besides, he thought, why would the Dark Wizard have possessed the dog to help save me? Whoever it was clearly wanted me dead. Unless... Milo's brow furrowed, lost deep in thought despite the freezing cold and rumblings from Hagrid, who was still chastising them for being reckless. Could it have been reconnaissance? Milo wondered. Did someone attack me just to find out how I'd fight back? Hannah did open up with stunners, I think, although why they're called stunners I have no idea, as they leave the target unconscious, not merely stunned, although she did fire off a number of killing curses as well. And in any case, if someone wants to find out how I fight, it can only be because they plan on fighting me themselves, meaning they want me dead, meaning they would have just left me to, hopefully, expire in the cold. Something still felt wrong, though, although Milo couldn't figure out what it was. Regardless of their intentions, Milo thought, I may have revealed my hand. They saw glitter dust, grease, and Summon Monster 3. They'll probably have worked out a counter to them by the time they challenge me in person, and they know about my last-ditch contingency plan, Milo cursed himself, which can easily be countered by preventing me from speaking, and in any case, gating in enough for Efriti to wish myself into omnipotence would take minutes or hours, so is effectively impossible in the middle of combat. So, Milo thought, as Hagrid carried him and Hannah to safety, what would I do to kill me, given what I know about myself and the local magic? The answer was surprisingly simple. A surprise attack with Avada Kedavra, loaded with as many attack bonus boosting buffs as possible. To which the only defense was, what? To anticipate the attack? To not be there to begin with? Death Ward would counter the killing curse, but it was a cleric spell. Nerve Skitter would help to win him to win on initiative, but that wouldn't do much if the attacker had a surprise round. Milo needed a good, long look at his spellbooks to determine what, if anything, he could do to counter such an attack. A loud creak broke Milo out of his train of thought. With a start, Milo realized they were already at the castle, and Hagrid had just pushed the main door open with his shoulder. Hagrid wasted no time carrying them up the stairs to the hospital wing, which Milo was starting to think of as a second home. The giant groundskeeper rapped hard on the doors until Pomfrey, still in her dressing gown, opened it sleepily. She took one look at the children and sighed. What did he do this time? She asked. Milo resented, somewhat, the implied accusation that it had been his fault, until he remembered that Hannah's injuries actually had been by his hand. But despite the exasperation evident in her tone, she had them laying down on the firm cots and checked over in record time, after shooing out Hagrid, that is, who didn't mind as he was leaving anyways to go find Dumbledore. She gasped when she saw the extent of their injuries. What happened to you? She asked Hannah. Then, after thinking a moment, added, No, never mind. Dumbledore will want to sort that out later. Don't say anything. A few healing charms later, and Hannah was out of the worst of it, albeit still exhausted and sore. As for you, she said, turning back to Milo, I think all you need is bandages, a cleaning charm to stave off infection, and prolonged bed rest. Based on your rather numerous prior visits to my hospital wing, the truth was, though she didn't say anything, that she was afraid to do anything else. She lay awake at night in a cold sweat caused by wondering what the hell the reason was behind his physiology, especially his apparent super healing powers. But, Milo protested, no buts. Now if you excuse me, I believe I'm shortly going to have to fend off the headmaster, and it always helps to have a certain measure of mental preparation before attempting so daunting a task. You two just try and get some sleep. The strict little Meta-Witch bustled off, muttering under her breath about how people never seem to require emergency medical attention at a reasonable hour, showing no consideration whatsoever. That left Milo and Hannah alone in the dark hospital wing, with the exception of the gently snoring Neville Longbottom, who had broken several ribs when Peeves had dropped a bust of some old, long-forgotten headmaster on him, As it turns out, Peeves had actually, as far as anyone could tell, dropped it by accident. Go figure. So, Milo started saying to break the awkward silence, how about that local sports team? Why did you go looking for me? Hannah asked. Then she paused for a moment. I mean, before you knew I was out in the snow. You know what I mean. Right, said Milo, who felt sort of dumb. What time is it? There was a clock on the wall, but he still couldn't make heads or tails of their numbers. Hannah said, momentarily thrown. It's 11:54, but what does... So it's still Christmas? He asked. Yeah, for 6... No, wait, make that 5 minutes. Awesome, Milo said, visibly relieved. Okay, hang on a second. I need to find something. Sifting through the many pockets of his belt of hidden pouches, technically, he could just hold his hand over it. Oh my goodness. A hot dog. With ketchup and onions. Exactly how I like it. Life is good. Sorry, I was saying something. I was reading something. Yes, it was important. Okay. Technically, he could just hold his hand over it and order the belt to spit out whatever item inside that he wanted, but he wanted to stay out of the habit of doing things that way to prevent him from announcing to the world what he was about to draw. He eventually found the small package he was looking for. I had a lot of difficulty with this, Milo admitted. See, where I'm from, we don't really give presents frequently. People, well, adventurers at least, tend to hoard their money and treasure and wouldn't dream of parting with it for anything. When we get presents, it's usually for, I don't know, rescuing the prince's sister from bandits or clearing out a cave of orcs. We tend to ignore holidays, and frankly, I don't know what the NPCs do during them. So I'm kind of new to this whole Christmas thing. It's bizarre. So I asked around, and from what I understand, most people buy something from shopkeepers that they think the recipient would enjoy. I tried that at first, but I ran into a number of difficulties. Anything I wanted, I'd have to owl order, obviously, because there aren't any shops in Hogwarts. This world is strange. I don't understand what any of the local wizarding stuff is or does most of the time, so I wouldn't know what to buy or even where to look for what to buy. Back in Azel, there's a strict price and production controls, and everybody knows exactly what's for sale everywhere, and that a bucket will always go for 5 silver pieces. They're posted in the equipment list. Don't even get me started on Muggle stuff. It's more foreign to me than psionics. Hannah stared at him oddly, apparently not understanding some of the terminology, but generally speaking, getting the gist. You didn't have to. I mean, you shouldn't have worried about it. I was led to believe it was important, he shrugged. Anyways, I came to the conclusion fairly quickly that if I was going to get you a present, I'd have to make it myself. The thing is, mundane stuff, non-magical that is, can, from what I can tell, be made by muggles better and faster than anything I could pull off, even if I used magic to help. But what I can make, and I'm pretty good at, is magic items. But that sounds really expensive. Milo shrugged. I've got ways of making money fast if I need to. That wasn't the big problem. What was the big problem? Hannah asked, riveted. Every single magic item, and I mean every magic item that has ever been decided, is for killing, or in some manner facilitating the killing of, goblins and dragons and things. That or for carrying their stuff away afterwards. And other uses largely the result of happy accident or complete afterthought. And killing goblins isn't something you seem particularly interested in, Milo said, as if the notion was both unthinkable and unpleasant. So I had to see if I could twist the purpose of an already existing magic item for more civilian. Milo was about to say NPC, but stopped himself at the last second. Purposes. And there were a few that I could do that, I mean, this belt of hidden pouches, I would be handy for anyone, right? Same with the magic bedroll, or maybe a bag of everlasting rations. Milo paused for a moment. Something with endure elements, now that I think about it, probably would have been a good idea. But anyways, everything I found, even then, required spells only available to clerics or druids or whatever. Wizards are usually a bit more on the offensive side of things. Look, it's totally fine if you didn't get me anything, Hannah said quietly. I wouldn't have minded. So the list of already designed magic items exhausted, I realized I had to design something from scratch. So I turned to the spells I did know to see what I could do. I had similar problems to a somewhat lesser extent. A wizard's spells are almost all designed for combat. Even the utility ones are mostly to help a wizard get to, or knowing wizards away from, combat. There was nothing that seemed particularly fun. Milo said the last word as if it was from an unfamiliar foreign language. So I said, screw it! Milo's actual wording, which he wisely decided not to repeat to Hannah, was somewhat different from this. I'll do what an adventurer does best and combine spells that were never designed to be combined. Gosh darn it. And this, your present, is the result. But before I give it to you, I need an answer to a very important question. What's that? Hannah asked, looking somewhat surprised. What's your favorite animal? Milo asked. Hannah thought about it for a moment. Hamsters, she said. Definitely hamsters. Okay, Milo said. Cool. Just 1 second. Milo had left literally 1 second in the magic item crafting process unfinished when he had originally made the item right before Christmas Eve. The result was that he could, at this point, still change any of the variables that had been decided during item creation. Now, here you are, Hannah Abbott. Milo passed her the present, wrapped in festive-looking holiday paper. Happy Christmas. Thank you, she said, accepting the package and, not being one of those fussy people who simply remove the tape and leave the paper unblemished, tore the wrapping paper to pieces from the middle outwards in about 1/3 of a second. Then she gasped. Inside, in a tiny box, was a tiny, fine, admittedly somewhat lopsided-looking, fragile-looking silver lily that could be attached to clothes by means of a minute pin on the back of the stem. An actual silversmith would shudder at the sight of Milo's somewhat crude handiwork, but all told, it was pretty well done, given that Milo didn't actually have any ranks in any form of craft. I made it by heating up a sickle until it was malleable enough to sculpt, Milo said. I couldn't have done it without those dragonhide gloves we have for herbology and potions. It's beautiful, Hannah said, somewhat breathless. No doubt her perceptions were somewhat addled by her traumatic day, sleep deprivation, and whatever was in the potions that Pomfrey had prescribed for her, as the silver lily could only be described as beautiful when being in the loosest possible sense of the word. Milo shrugged, somewhat embarrassed. That's not really the point, he admitted. In truth, he'd made it out of silver so it could be used as an improvised weapon against devils if necessary. It never hurts to be prepared, after all. But Milo decided, for some reason, against saying so at that precise moment. If you tap it and say, I'm bored, it'll... Actually, just tap it and say that you're bored, and you'll see. Looking at Milo curiously, Hannah complied. I'm bored, she said, tapping the silver pin. Nothing happened. Oh, right, you have to be wearing it first, Milo said. I forgot about that part. Hannah, looking extremely curious, pinned the lily to the front of her robes. I'm bored, she repeated with another tap. Suddenly, a small, fluffy, impossibly cute, in fact, almost sickeningly so, brown and white hamster appeared in her hands. It's so cute! Hannah squealed in the manner of little girls everywhere as the hamster scurried up her arm, chirped in a manner that would make real hamsters feel like they had to go and watch Die Hard while doing one-handed push-ups just to counter the sheer adorability. The hamster didn't have fat so much as it had pudge, fur so much as it had fluff, or eyes so much as it had big, glassy, shiny windows to your very soul. Simply seeing it required a will save, or you were compelled to want to hug it. Okay, not really, but it may as well have. Milo was particularly proud about his little invention. which was simply a tricked-out wondrous item of unseen servant and minor image, both of which he had to research specifically for this task, and a little detect thoughts. The servant, which was a formless, invisible blob capable of moving around and exerting a limited amount of force, was surrounded with an illusionary body of an animal chosen during item creation, in this case, a hamster. The specifics of which were chosen using a brief detect thoughts-like effect on the pen's first user to find the form the user would find maximally cute. The servant was then ordered to play with the user until dismissed, unless otherwise commanded. "This," Hannah said, the hamster running up her arm to the shoulder, "is the best Christmas present ever." "Thank you, or you're welcome. I'm not actually sure which is applicable here," he admitted. "I believe both are perfectly applicable," Hannah said, stifling a laugh. You just tap the pin and say bye, and it'll go away until you reactivate it," Milo explained. "It can do other stuff if you tell it to, like carry or clean things." "Like the Hogwarts statues?" Hannah asked eagerly. "Things exactly like Hogwarts statues," Milo said. "Thank you," Hannah said again. "Really, I mean it. You clearly put a ton of effort into this. I was just going to get you a big bag of every flavored beans because of how much you enjoyed them on Halloween, but now..." "Every flavored beans?" Milo's face broke into a huge smile. "I love those things." Hannah hesitated for a second. "Okay, then I'll still get you a big pack of every flavored beans. I've got them up in the girls' dorm. I didn't give them to you already because, well, it doesn't matter now, actually." She must mean the week or so she wasn't talking to me because I asked her about the lake, Milo thought. People are strange. You can have them in the morning." "Sweet," Milo said. "No pun intended?" Hannah asked. Milo groaned. "Bye, hamster," Hannah said, tapping the pin, and the impossibly cute critter vanished. Hannah hesitated for a moment, and then said, "I'd go over and give you a hug or something." She looked somewhat embarrassed, "except that I don't really think my legs want to respond." "That's okay," Milo said, feeling somewhat awkward. "I'll take a rain check." Good, Hannah said. And an awkward silence, punctuated only by Neville's calm and constant snoring, descended for a beat or three as Milo decided there was absolutely nothing more fascinating than his fingernails, and Hannah examined the pin. "So how about," Milo said, while Hannah said, "I think we should," at the same time. They both then paused for the other to continue. "You go first," they said simultaneously. They both looked around the room for a while, waiting for the other to continue. "I was going to say we should maybe go to sleep," Hannah said. "Same," agreed Milo. "Okay, good night," she said, and rolled over to face away from him. "Good night." People are weird, Milo thought again, and not for the last time at that, and rolled over to do the same. "So you have defeated my minions!" Thamior the Thaumaturge spat, reaching for his pouch of spell components. "But do you really think you can challenge me? You fools! For it is I, the dread Wait, Thamior?" Milo said as his companions reached for their weapons. "I'm confused." "That is only natural, seeing as how you are a fool. It's just that I thought Thamior was a male name," Milo said, his voice kept carefully neutral. "Which is fitting, seeing as how I am, in fact, male," Thamior said, slightly confused, and evidently irritated at being interrupted in the middle of his monologue. "But you're an elf," Milo said. "You have a talent for stating the obvious, fool. Unfortunately, it won't help you to avoid joining my Legion of the But I thought there weren't any elf males." "You will pay for your insolence!" the purple-cloaked Thamior shouted, his eyes glowing red. "When I am God Emperor of all the multiverse, I will... Wait, what's going on?" Milo felt a strange tingling sensation somewhere in his midriff, gradually growing to encompass his torso. In panic, he looked down to find that, where his stomach should be, there was a slowly growing sphere of darkness, occasionally crackling with what looked like green lightning. "Gah!" Milo said as the sphere growing to reach his neck. "How did... I won initiative, damn it! This isn't fair!" But Thamur just looked as surprised as Milo felt, and was backing away slowly from him. There was a brief flash of blindingly bright light, and Milo suddenly felt cold all over. His lungs strained painfully, trying futilely to find air, and his brain screamed at him that things were very, very wrong. Gravity seemed to tug at him inconsistently in every direction, before finally agreeing to pull him backwards. He struggled, swinging his arms wildly to find something, anything solid, until... thud. Milo sat bolt upright, clutching his side, where just a moment before, the sphere of blackness had begun to grow. To his surprise, he realized both his hands were wrapped around his belt of hidden pouches. He looked around, expecting danger, but he saw instead only the depressingly familiar sights of the Hogwarts hospital wing. He blinked, realizing it was only a dream, and a weirdly vivid one at that. Milo couldn't, this time, speak from experience, but from what he'd heard from other adventurers, dreams that were more like flashbacks were always important to the plot. The only thing was, in this case, he couldn't figure out for the life of him how this could be so. Milo wasn't sure how long he was staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what in the hells was going on, what had brought him here, and just what significance of his dream was when he realized he wasn't alone. Well, he knew he wasn't alone. Neville's rumbling snores unfortunately made sure of that. Also Hannah. Okay, he obviously wasn't alone. What Milo meant to think was that there was someone else awake in the hospital wing with him. You could consider cutting him some slack, of course, seeing as how he just woke up. "Professor?" Milo asked curiously. "Milo?" Professor Quirrell, standing by the door, stammered. "I was just checking on you to see if you would be up for dueling club on Sunday." "That's..." Milo did some rapid arithmetic. 4 days from now? Definitely. I'll be up and about by tomorrow." "Indeed?" Quirrell asked, surprised. "Your injuries look most severe. I see the good Madame Pomfrey has opted not to use magic on you?" Milo shrugged, painfully. "I can heal anything short of death in about a day, if I have help. I think Pomfrey's afraid of how your magic will interact with with me, I guess." "Well," Quirrell said, glancing at the clock, "I'm afraid I have to run. The doxies in the dungeon won't chase themselves out. I will wish you a speedy recovery, and to that end left you a present." Quirrell gestured at a box of chocolate frogs on Milo's bedside table. Goodbye." Bye. Thanks," Milo said. The Defense Against the Dark Arts professor walked out of the room at about a half step faster than normal walking speed, presumably to avoid a lecture from Pomfrey. Milo waited for the door to close behind him, then turned to the frogs. "Detect poison," he cast, just in case. When they turned out to be clean, he stashed them in his belt for later. Milo glanced at the heavy mechanical clock on the wall, noting that, while he could tell that the little hand was pointed at just past 6, and the big hand was pointing at 3, he had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Deciding it didn't really matter one way or the other, Milo figured he would just go back to sleep. Only a few minutes passed before Milo heard the door creak open. "Back, Professor?" Milo asked, sitting up despite his protesting muscles and various grievous wounds. "Front, student?" came an aged, grandfatherly voice. "Headmaster?" Milo asked, genuinely surprised, as Dumbledore walked calmly up to his bed, dressed in his signature purple robes and half-moon spectacles. "I thought Madame Pomfrey—" "What the good Medowitch said to me was, in fact, and I quote, 'You won't be bothering any of my patients tonight, Headmaster, Supreme Mugwump or no. As it is, in fact, now the morning and not, in fact, the night, her prohibition is no longer in effect.'" Dumbledore paused for a moment. "But it is entirely possible that she would not, in fact, see eye to eye on my interpretation of her command, so if you would be so good as to keep your voice down." "Sure," Milo responded quietly. "What brings you here? And more importantly, why did you say front student?" "I was talking, as it were, a shot in the dark as to what I had guessed, incorrectly it would appear, might be a social custom from your homeland. You see, you said back professor, so I thought perhaps the correct response was to, as is the custom amongst a small tribe of merfolk living in a pond in Kashmir, to say the precise opposite. Alas, it was, as is so often the case when one ventures into the murky grounds of speculation. I was incorrect. And as to your first question, I am here, as you can surely guess, to question you about the events of yesterday. Oh, that. It's fairly straightforward, Milo said, and gave Dumbledore a rather more accurate version of the story than the one he had given Hagrid. Lying to Dumbledore's face seemed, to Milo, on par with kicking a lantern archon. I have no idea what that is. To his credit, Dumbledore sat patiently, listening to the entire story through until the end before asking questions. And then Fang led Hagrid to us, and he carried us back to the castle, Milo finished. Speaking of which, I'm going to need to go back at some point and get my rope and stuff. Made by elves, you know. Or at least the sign had said so. In truth, it was hard to find rope anywhere that wasn't claimed to have been made by elves. By elves! One day, when we are both free from the constant pressings of urgent business, I would greatly enjoy listening to you tell me exactly all about the strange land from which you hail. But until then, some such beefier answers to more specific questions will have to suffice. First, could you explain to me exactly what the effects are of the charm you cast on Hannah to free her from the effects of her mental control? Sure, Milo said. Protection from evil. Right now, it lasts up to 5 minutes, but I can push that to 7 with my gloves. Milo held up his gloved hands, wriggled his fingers somewhat. And for that duration, the target can't be affected by any form of mental control. When the spell ends, the control starts up again. Also, they can't be touched by summoned non-good monsters. Fascinating, Dumbledore said. That little spell of yours would have saved the Ministry a great deal of trouble over the years. May I counter with a question of my own? Milo asked. Of course you may, Dumbledore said, but whether I shall answer or not is, I am afraid, another matter entirely. I can promise you this, everything I say shall be the unblemished truth. Can you tell me how Hannah was being controlled, who did it, where they live, and how well protected they are? Dumbledore laughed softly. That was 4 questions, you realize, and I'm afraid that I'm only able to answer your first. I cannot be sure until I question Miss Abbott directly, of course, but I am quite certain that she was the unfortunate victim of one of the darkest forms of magic known. You already have, unfortunately, witnessed the use of the most terrible of the 3 unforgivable curses, the killing curse. Milo nodded. It was the first spell he'd seen cast by the wizards of this world, in fact. The curses are so called because the use of one on a human being is enough to warrant a life sentence in Azkaban, the wizard prison. Normally, the specifics of the unforgivable are not learned until a student's 6th year, but in your case, I fear you may well be in danger without being forewarned. Along with the killing curse are the Cruacious Curse, which causes extreme pain in its victim, and the Imperious Curse. This last one, despite being the most pleasant for the unfortunate victim, has caused more disasters, deaths, and crisis than the other 2 put together, directly or indirectly. The Imperious Curse allows direct mental control over the target for, if necessary, years at a time. Used by a skilled wizard or witch, is almost impossible to detect and even harder to resist. You mean it doesn't allow a will save? Milo asked, incredulous. Such a spell was too powerful to exist. I'm afraid I don't altogether understand the question, Dumbledore admitted. Who is Will, and why does he need saving? Milo said, I mean, it can't be fought off with strength of mind alone? Oh, it's possible, Dumbledore conceded, but only a handful of exceptionally strong-willed individuals are able to do so. You're kidding, right? Milo said. These wizards are insanely broken. A spell that kind on a touch attack without a save was bad enough. At least you had to be hit, but in a spell that lets you dominate someone indefinitely and had, apparently, an incredibly large bonus to its DC? Milo was briefly surprised that the whole ministry wasn't run by dark wizards, before remembering how many pies Lucius Malfoy had his fingers in. Well, he thought, that would explain why people don't seem to realize how obviously evil he is. Anyone with any power is probably his thrall already. A frightening image came to Milo's mind of a thin, pale spider sitting on a large, dark room surrounded by thousands of silken spider webs, from each of dangled a major ministry official like puppets. Milo realized he was badly mixing his metaphors, but under the circumstances, he had other things to worry about. So, what do you do about it? Milo asked. What's the counter strategy? There isn't much, Dumbledore admitted. Keeping a close eye on one's associates and friends to see if they begin acting strangely, occasionally checking if they still remember past events, that sort of thing. It is, at best, only moderately effective. Milo paled. And now you see why it is that knowledge of these curses that is kept to the upper year students, Dumbledore said. But now I have another question for you. Hit me, Milo said, trying to keep his mind from the horrifying implications of this curse. I think I will refrain from doing so, Dumbledore said, as corporal punishment is generally more frowned upon now than it was in the days of Emmerich the Evil. Why did you go out in search of Miss Hannah Abbott yesterday morning? Oh, Milo said, I thought I mentioned. I had to give her her Christmas present. Fascinating as that is not precisely the answer I was looking for, as I think you know. To clarify, why, after you discovered that Miss Abbott had left the building, did you head out and search for her? Milo sighed. I thought something seemed wrong, Milo said, and that she might be in trouble. And before you ask, no, it never occurred to me to ask a teacher for help. And why was that? Dumbledore pressed. Same reason as the troll, Milo explained as if it were obvious. It's what I do. I rather think not, Dumbledore said. After Halloween, you explained to me, and I have reason to believe you were telling the truth, that you challenged the troll rather than doing the sensible thing and running away, because fighting monsters was, as you say, what you do. You said, when I asked you then whether it was to protect innocent lives, that was not the case, and doing so was only a perk, was, I believe, the word you used. What's your point? Milo asked, not used to prolonged conversations with NPCs and not full realizing that he was being rude. Do you have any inkling, when you left, that a monster or dark wizard was involved in Hannah Abbott's mysterious exit? Milo thought about it. No. Do you suspect, at that point, that she was being forced against her will? Milo scratched his itchy bandages, playing for time. Eventually, he was forced to admit that he hadn't suspected anything of the sort. So, as far as you knew, she had simply been exceptionally foolish and wandered out into the snow and harsh winds and sub-zero temperatures. I hadn't really thought about it, Milo admitted, but if someone had asked me right then why I thought she was outside, that's probably how I would have answered. And you went looking for her. Of course, Milo said, still not entirely sure where he was going. Not to fight monsters. Nope, Milo agreed. But to protect an innocent life, Dumbledore asked. I suppose so? To protect Hannah, mostly. It's a start, Dumbledore said. And you didn't do it because, from a cold mechanical perspective, she would be of use to you, perhaps in your crusade against evil? No, Milo said. I can't see how she would be. Her talents lie in other directions. Milo said, feeling for some reason a bit defensive about her. Not everyone has to be good at fighting to be worth saving, Headmaster. I feel, and feel free to correct me if I am wrong, that may not have been the answer you gave me when we first met. Milo shrugged. She's my friend, Milo said. I've always protected my... He trailed off. He had been about to say, I've always protected my friends, but now that he thought about it, he'd never really had friends. He protected his party members, of course, but that came with a job description like fighting monsters. Hannah, Milo was, for once, unsure of her PC-NPC status, but was fairly sure that she wasn't exactly in the party. But didn't that make her, by definition, an NPC? Milo went cold. He'd risked his life to save an NPC without any hint or hope of a reward. He'd spent days, thousands of gold pieces, and hundreds of XP working on a magic item to simply give to an NPC because he'd hurt her feelings. He actually cared about what an NPC felt. What the hells was happening to him? Milo felt queasy. I didn't even loot that corpse! He was stunned. He'd simply thrown away the red-capped sword, which could have probably got him at least 10 gold pieces, assuming it counted as a short sword, and who knows what else the grotesque abomination had been carrying. Milo was disgusted with himself. He let his emotions run away with him, getting in the way of good old pragmatic greed. I think, said Dumbledore, what you are feeling right now, and it may be that you are experiencing it for the first time and as such is confusing to you, is an aspect of a form of magic more ancient and powerful than any that Voldemort himself possesses. What? Milo gasped. Detect magic, he cast. But nothing happened. For a brief, horrible moment, he wondered if this mysterious magic that had apparently so addled his brain had also disabled his spellcasting. Then he remembered that he was simply out of spells, even cantrips, until he could prepare new ones. What kind of magic? Dispel me, Dumbledore! Dumbledore chuckled. Even if I could, he said, no power on earth could compel me to do so. Do you mean to say that you're behind this insanity? No, Milo, the power of which I speak, the power that Voldemort so casually disregards, the power which was his undoing 11 years ago, the power which is, currently, already drawing you under its influence and subtly altering your perception of the world and your actions, is, you will find, quite beyond the reach of any mortal magic. So you do have deities around here? The power of which I speak, young Milo, is love. Milo stared at him in utter silence, his jaw hanging open. Trying to work, but no sound came out. In the end, Milo had to make a concentration check simply to focus the necessary thought to activate his vocal cords. Shh! I think, said Dumbledore, that I will so rudely head you off before you finish that thought. Love, Milo said flatly. You know who was brought down by the power of love. It's in the power of love. Sorry, I had to. Maybe instead of learning magic, we should be putting flowers in our hair and frolicking in the forest like those pointy-eared pansies and singing around campfires. Voldy would be powerless to resist our flower power. If that stretches your credulity, perhaps, I could more clearly state that it was love which triggered ancient and powerful protective magic, Dumbledore said calmly. Oh, well, why didn't you tell me so in the first place? Asked Milo. I'd love to have seen the expression on he who must not be named's face when a throwaway, poorly thought-out rule from an obscure splat book that he had never even bothered to read blew up in his face. Why do you say it was poorly thought out? Dumbledore asked curiously. It allowed an infant to defeat the most powerful dark wizard that ever lived, Milo said, as if the reason was obvious. That's got to be the most broken rule in existence. I gotta get me some of that. What exactly happened to trigger it? Normally I would leave this for Harry himself to tell you, but in this case, the story is quite well known. You see, Voldemort was defeated because Harry's mother sacrificed her life to protect her son, out of love, which placed a protection upon Harry that Voldemort was unable to overcome. Milo paused, the implications of this dawning on him. How on the prime material did you know who ever get to be that powerful in the first place, then? I'm not sure I completely understand your question. Voldemort used a combination of subterfuge, cruelty, devoted power followers, and powerful magic. No, I mean, I'm obviously no expert on the subject, but do mothers here not care about their children? Milo asked, still perplexed. Of course they do, Dumbledore said. I should think that the story I just told you was proof of that. Do dark wizards not kill infants, then? Unfortunately, innocent children are no safer from their evil than fully trained wizards. Then how, in the name of the eternal library of Bacab, did you know who, and Grindelwald, and all the other dark wizards that ever lived, managed to rise to power without, at some point, attempting to kill the child that the mother died to protect? I mean, how many mothers wouldn't die to protect their children, especially if they lived in a world where doing so made their children literally invincible to dark magic? Milo was idly wondering if he could work something like this into his backstory, which would neatly solve his problem for dealing with the killing curse. Dumbledore opened his mouth as if to answer, but before he could, the door slammed open. Out! Shrieked an irate Madame Pomfrey. I won't have you bothering my patients. They need to rest in peace. Wait, poor choice of wording. They need restful peace. Peaceful rest. Not to be bothered by constant questions. Ironically, while Dumbledore was speaking quietly and softly, it was Pomfrey's tirade that woke up the sleeping Hannah and Neville. Blast, said Dumbledore quietly. Rumbled, it would seem. He stood up and walked slowly towards the Mediwitch, hands outstretched in a calming gesture. Ah, my dear Madame Pomfrey, just the witch I was hoping to see. Did I ever tell you how exceptional I've always found your work? He put an arm on her shoulder as he walked her to the door, evidently hoping that she'd be taken in and follow him out. She looked briefly mollified, then her eyes hardened again, and she brushed his arm off. No, I'm on to your tricks, Headmaster. Don't think you can silver-tongue your way out of things this time. Alas, Dumbledore sighed. Foiled again. Might we at least continue what I'm certain will be a most pleasant discussion outside, so as not to disturb your patients further? Pomfrey threw a quick, surprised glance at Hannah and Neville, who were looking around blearily to find out where the war had started and whether they ought to go find helmets in a foxhole. Perhaps that would be for the best, Pomfrey said in a much quieter voice, and followed the headmaster out, having lost the initiative. Dumbledore glanced over his shoulder and winked at Milo, then walked out with the somewhat bemused-looking healer. Why was Dumbledore here? Hannah asked, fighting down a yawn. He wanted to ask me about yesterday, Milo explained. He'll probably come back later to talk to you about it. Oh, said Hannah, who, if truth be told, would be just as happy forgetting it had ever happened. Then she shrugged and went back to sleep. Milo, whose brain was racked with too many unanswered questions. Dumbledore, Milo had noticed, had an unfortunate habit of answering a question in a way that provided 12 more, started memorizing spells simply to clear his head. Unfortunately, the arcane sigils in his book kept blurring together and dancing in front of his vision for him to make much progress, and he grudgingly set aside his spellbook for later. He hadn't had trouble preparing spells since he was at apprentice level. So I've been bewitched, have I? Enchanted by powerful and ancient magic that's compromising my ability to think logically. There must be some cure. Break enchantment probably wouldn't even do it, as it only works on spells of 5th level or lower. This love magic business sounds closer to 9th level. Assuming magic here even has levels, of course. Maybe there's some cure to be found in the local magic. Dumbledore says there wasn't, but not even he can know everything, right? Maybe if I... Hey, Neville said abruptly. Oh, hi, Nev, Milo responded. What's up? Well, you looked busy earlier, but now that you're not studying anymore, I thought I'd ask what happened. You and Hannah look pretty beaten up. Did Peeves do something? No, I got gutted by a redcap with a sword. Oh, said Neville. Wow, why didn't you just pull out your wand and cast... Didn't have time, Milo lied. Shame, 'cause this is a dead easy spell. Even I can do it, and I'm rubbish at, well, everything. We should probably be quiet, Milo said. Hannah's trying to sleep. Damn it, I did it again. Did what? Neville asked. Nothing, Milo said, having forgotten that NPCs could hear you when you weren't speaking directly to them. You're right, though, of course, Neville said. You can tell me about it later. Milo lay back, cursing his confused brain. Everything had seemed so simple a few months ago. PCs help you defeat monsters and get treasure. NPCs give you treasure for defeating monsters. Everything was becoming so tangled lately. And his combat skills must be going rusty as well. That red cap, judging by the XP he earned, was only CR2. He nearly died fighting it, which was completely unacceptable. The problem, looking at it in hindsight, was obvious. Milo's spell list was carefully optimized for what he had previously considered to be typical combat. As a wizard, his job was to neutralize as many enemies as possible in the first few rounds of combat, so that his party members with knives and pointy things could move in and do the actual damage unimpeded. To that end, he preferred spells that could make as many enemies as possible, as useless as possible, as quickly as possible. Thus grease and glitter dust. But lately, he'd been involved in a lot of solo adventures, and Milo wasn't capable of dishing out that kind of damage necessary to finish off an enemy, which is why he'd had so much trouble with the troll and the red cap. It meant he had to burn a much larger number of spells per enemy than he normally would, and as a result, he ran out of ammo perceptibly fast. I should stop going alone, he realized. I need backup. That and the capability to rain down fiery doom, just in case. Milo briefly considered Fireball, but realized that at his current level, the much more toned down Kelgor's Firebolt would deal the same amount of damage without the same possibility for collateral damage. Also, being a conjuration spell, he would get a few more bonuses from his school's specialty. Fireball would take longer to research, being a 3rd level spell. Kelgor's little toy was only a 1st level spell. So Milo opted to begin research on Kelgor's Firebolt now and get Fireball afterwards, and maybe Scorching or Seeking Ray after that. Thinking about spells, tactics, and general optimization had put Milo back into his more usual mindset, and he opted to continue memorizing spells. A few minutes after the requisite hour had passed, the door opened again to reveal yet more visitors. Harry and Ron walked in. Ron looked part worried and part excited, while Harry just looked distracted. Ron, to Milo's delight, was carrying a platter laden with toast, butter, and tea. "Blimey," said Ron. "What happened? We were worried when you didn't come back last night, but figured you just got off to work on something mad like you usually do. Next morning, Dumbledore himself walks into the common room and asks us to take breakfast up to you and Hannah. Hi, Hannah." Hannah had woken up when they entered and was staring at the food with undisguised greed. "And blimey, you look terrible." Ron was, however, carrying food, so Milo decided to let him live. This time. "Yeah," Harry said distractedly. Milo shrugged, and for the 3rd time, he told the story again, glossing over the part where he'd accidentally knifed the girl now sitting a few feet away from him. "I reckon you couldn't have just driven the madcap off with—" "No," Milo sighed, resolving to punch the next person who suggested using one of the local wizard's simple anti-mat redcap spells. "I can't cast those, remember? Anyways, what's up with you two?" "What do you mean?" Ron asked. "Harry's off in his own little world," Milo said. "Is he?" Ron asked, looking over his shoulder at the boy who'd been staring absently at one of Milo's bed fixtures. "You're right," Ron said, surprised. "He is. Oi, Potter, what's going on in there?" "I saw my parents last night," Harry said reluctantly. "What, like in a dream?" Milo asked, "'cause they seem to be going around." "No," Harry said. "In a mirror." All right, ladies and gentlemen, that would be the end of chapter 19. Visitors was the title of that chapter. So we did 18 and 19 tonight, which means 20 next week, which will be about the Mirror of Erised. In fact, that is the title of the chapter. The guys are having a roaring good time. Can you hear them really clearly? I'm sorry if it's too loud. I can hear them laughing and stuff. I was hoping that this mic wasn't so sensitive that you would hear them laughing and stuff, but it sounds like that is the case. Sorry. I just wanted to give a quick shout out and thank you to our patrons, because you guys help make everything possible. Besides helping pay for the new microphone that we had to get that is apparently a little too good, also having wonderful things like hot dogs and editing equipment is just great. So thank you to all of those who have helped out. If you would like to become a patron, or if you're interested in helping us out by purchasing us a jittery beverage, that information is in our links area. I am also working on getting together a potential Fate campaign now that Itty Bitty Kitty Committee is on hiatus for the foreseeable future. Putting together a Fate campaign, which we might do as like a 4-week run in August for my patrons, which will be streamed here. So if you're interested in participating in that, go ahead and join our patrons for that. Thank you all so much for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate. And remember that if people can hate for no reason, then I can love for no reason. So I love all of you, and I hope you have a good rest of your night. Be well. Bye.